Henry Ford smiles, accepting a gleaming metal Nazi Germany's highest honor for foreigners, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. It's 1938, and as the gold swastika glistens on his chest, Hitler's portrait looms in the background of the luxurious German consulate in Detroit. Ford doesn't flinch, doesn't hesitate. The man worshipped as America's industrial genius and working-class champion accepts honors from the regime preparing for genocide. His automobile factories in Germany are already being retooled for war machines that will devastate Europe. The creator of the affordable car that democratized transportation has spent millions publishing anti-Jewish propaganda that sits prominently on Hitler's desk. The world watches America's icon embrace fascism, and history holds its breath, but somehow, decades later, this moment vanishes from his legacy. The image lingers, a ribbon across a chest, a portrait looming on a wall. It is meant to shock. Yet when you open a high school textbook or visit a museum exhibit, that scene is nowhere to be found. What most people learned about Henry Ford is tidy, clean, and comfortable. Now we step back into that taught story, the one everyone knows, to see how neat it really is. You learned he was a self-made man from Michigan, a tinkerer who engineered the Model T and invented the assembly line. Textbooks show a smiling farmer turned inventor, the quintessential American success. Museums roll archival footage, black and white factories humming, workers assembling cars in rhythm, families driving out to the suburbs in a car that cost less than a year's wages. The $5 day appears as a headline, generous, progressive, almost paternal. The narrative is simple. Ford democratized mobility, lifted the working class, and, in one generous stroke, changed the modern world. In classrooms, the story is told with clean props. A teacher points to a map as suburbs bloom outward from cities. A documentary edits Thomas Edison into a kindly mentor at Ford's side. A voiceover intones that the Model T changed everything. Museum placards echo the same cadence: invention, efficiency, benevolence. 2 or 3 stock, official lines appear again and again. He made cars affordable for ordinary Americans. He doubled wages to stabilize the workforce. He was a genius of industry. Those lines are not false. They are, however, incomplete. They are the comfortable frame that lets people sleep the rest of history away. The official story polishes contradictions into virtues. Rigidity becomes consistency. Opposition to unions becomes independence. Resistance to redesign the Model T for almost 2 decades becomes dedication to simplicity. The parts that don't fit the tidy picture, the private detectives, the internal spy networks, the invoked spirit of pastoral America amid industrial sprawl, are edited out, footnoted away, or explained as eccentricities. Why does the sanitized version win? Who benefits when a complex life is refashioned into a national myth? The answer is not only sentimental, it is transactional. Corporations, educators, and media industries all have an interest in a clear, uncomplicated founding story. An industrial hero sells museums, school curricula, and a cultural certainty that capitalism yields heroes and heroes yield prosperity. During the Cold War, the need for industrial exemplars intensified. Ford's life was repurposed as proof that free enterprise was superior to socialism. In that moment, inconvenient facts became embarrassments to be relegated to the margins. Imagine a montage. Classroom images dissolve to corporate brochures, then to newsreels and movie reels. The same photo of Ford at a Model T rollout reappears in brochures, textbooks, and a commemorative stamp. Hollywood scripts simplify. Industry-sponsored films show the gleaming factory floor but omit the cries from the picket line. The Henry Ford Museum becomes a shrine to ingenuity, lovingly curated artifacts, polished captions, a version of history that prioritizes achievement over moral complexity. Listen to the voices of the myth. A textbook narrator speaks plainly. Ford believed in hard work and the dignity of manufacturing. A corporate archivist adds, Ford saved workers from poverty by creating consumer culture. A museum guide smiles and says, he doubled wages because he cared about his men. Each line sounds plausible, authoritative, and safe. They form a chorus that drowns out the quieter papers in attics and the memoranda in archive boxes. You saw this story in the films and field trips that shape most people's first exposure to the past. It feels familiar because it is repeated across generations. It comforts because it suggests moral symmetry. Innovation begets progress. Progress begets good lives. But the very neatness of that symmetry is a clue. When a complex life is saying so simply, it often means someone has deliberately arranged the score. There are practical reasons for that arrangement. Teaching history to millions requires simplification. Museums must draw paying crowds. Industry wants to claim a triumphant lineage. Yet when simplification becomes sanitization, when sharp edges are shaved off to produce a palatable idol, a dangerous amnesia sets in. The myth begins to do work not only commemorative, but prescriptive. It shapes policy choices, workplace norms, and political rhetoric. Who, precisely, gains from a sanitized Henry Ford? The list is long. Corporations gain a legend that validates hierarchical control and efficiency first management. Political movements gain a symbol proving technological progress and capitalist benevolence are interchangeable. Schools gain a tidy lesson plan. The cultural industries, films, museums, books gain a marketable hero. Even philanthropy benefits. When a foundation carries a famous name, donations follow the flattering story. None of these incentives require conspiracy, only mutual convenience. In the official telling, problems are framed as quirks. The private security that cracked skulls at strikes becomes discipline. The sociological home inspections that policed workers' families become welfare oversight. The contradictions are rationalized. This reconciliation creates a story that people can tell themselves about progress without feeling the weight of cost. Yet the excised fragments, the threats, the private armies, the surveillance continue to exist in archives. They accumulate, and when examined one by one, they open fissures in the story so big they no longer fit as mere footnotes. If the tidy story is the stage set, what we will do next is pull back the curtains. We will look at the seams. The Model T on a pedestal casts a shadow, and in that shadow are details that unsettle the memory the nation has chosen to keep. Those details will shift the scene, and with them, what we think we know about Ford, labor, and the shape of modern America. You've just watched the polished portrait. Up next, the cracks begin to show. Before we go on, thank you for watching this investigation this far. This channel is young and trying to build a space where complicated histories can be told honestly. If you value this work, consider subscribing. Every new subscriber helps this kind of research reach a wider audience and keeps the lights on for more stories schools never taught. Your support matters. The first breaks in the picture are small at first. A bruised forearm in an old photograph, a terse internal memo, a neighborhood rumor. Slowly they accumulate into a pattern. The champion of the worker, the man who doubled pay, also built a company that spied on its employees, policed their homes, and deployed rough men to crush organizing. That collision between public generosity and private coercion is the first serious fissure. Start with the $5 day. The headline reads like benevolence, higher wages to lift families. In practice, it solved a business problem. In 1913, Ford was hemorrhaging employees. Turnover rates soared to nearly 380% in some departments. The assembly line was efficient for producing cars. It was brutal for producing stable workers. Paying more was a pragmatic fix. It reduced quitting and stabilized production. It worked, but the wage increase came with strings. A sociological department was created and funded by the company. Trained investigators, sometimes called snoopers, by workers visited workers' homes to check that wages were spent correctly, that families maintained what Ford considered clean. The photo of men being beaten in an industrial plaza is a different picture altogether. It suggests an operation that equated dissent with crime. It hints at a company culture where private enforcers answered to a CEO's whim, not to the law or to public opinion. Behind those incidents, there was structure. Networks of internal spies, daily reports on worker morale, lists of suspected agitators. Men with pasts full of violence and a ledger to keep were given authority to act. They were effective. Fear kept many heads down. The plant ran with fewer interruptions. Efficiency improved, at a cost that no museum placard mentions. Another unexpected contradiction appears in Ford's relationship with history. Publicly, he professed disdain. History is bunk, he said. Yet he poured money into building Greenfield Village, a sprawling collection of pre-industrial American buildings, artifacts, and recreated small-town scenes. He purchased and reconstructed old houses, bridges, a schoolhouse, and even a printing press. He curated an idealized rural past. At the same time, he pioneered mass production that pulled millions from the countryside into factory life. Imagine standing in Greenfield Village, a dirt road, a hand pump, a blacksmith forging a horseshoe. Now imagine, a mile away, an assembly line that has already rendered that world obsolete. The juxtaposition was intentional. It created a narrative that modernity, Ford's industrial modernity, could be married to a sanitized, nostalgic American identity. It told visitors that, despite machines and migration, the true nation remained pastoral, white, and stable. It is an aesthetic that often undergirds exclusionary politics. Then there is the curious story of the peace ship. In 1915, at the height of World War I, Ford funded an expedition, the so-called peace ship, to sail to Europe and broker talks to end the war. It made headlines. Cameras photographed Ford up on deck, a billionaire turned do-gooder. The stunt did not stop the war. Meanwhile, Ford factories converted models and tools to produce military material in wartime, and the company profited handsomely from government contracts. A public pacifist who benefited from war production. The contradiction is stark. These are not isolated eccentricities. They cohere into a pattern where public-facing moral gestures often accompany private structures of control and profit. The same step that increased worker cash wages also gave the company power to intrude into workers' lives. The same cultural nostalgia that sold a vision of American simplicity helped normalize a social order that excluded and surveilled. Personal details make the pattern human and unsettling. Edsel Ford, Henry's only son, was micromanaged and humiliated by his father. Publicly, Edsel was installed as the company's president in 1919. Privately, Henry undermined him. He mocked decisions, overruled appointments, and kept veto power from the shadows. For employees, this meant that there was always one real boss above the facade of corporate governance. For the family, it was psychological cruelty. That temperament likely informed the corporate culture, absolute control, vertical command, and personal loyalty trumping institutional checks. When the Depression hit, another gap appears between talk and action. The man who had once doubled wages fought government relief and resisted policies that might stabilize the larger economy. He slashed pay where he could and fired thousands. The public mythology expects industrial fathers to shield their people during crisis. In practice, Henry Ford prioritized the company's balance sheet and his autonomy over broader social solidarity. The contradictions make a larger question unavoidable. Was Ford an inconsistent man or a calculating strategist who used popular gestures to secure private aims? The evidence suggests both. He understood public narratives. He staged generous acts that improved public opinion while building mechanisms to maintain personal control over labor, culture, and memory. Another, darker seam runs overseas. Ford's public honors from Germany, culminating in the 1938 decoration known as the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, cannot be explained simply as business pragmatism. In 1938, Kristallnacht had already occurred. The award was a political statement. In Germany, Ford's anti-Semitic publications had gained an audience. Young Nazis hung his portrait in offices. Hitler admired him. In main camps, he praised Ford explicitly as an exemplar against Jewish influence. The relationship between Ford and the rising fascist movement in Europe was not incidental. It was, at minimum, ideologically sympathetic and, at worst, enabling. That brings us to the darkest pivot, the Dearborn Independent. Ford bought the paper in 1919 and for years turned it into a vehicle for a series called The International Jew. Week after week, for decades, the paper propagated a systematic, pseudo-scholarly antisemitism. The articles recycled the debunked protocols of the Elders of Zion and stitched old prejudices into a narrative of global conspiracy. With forced distribution through dealerships and a network that reached hundreds of thousands, this propaganda did not stay local. It traveled, was translated, and influenced actors beyond America's shores. When evidence linked those articles to broader movements of hate, the response was not a candid retraction. Instead, Ford offered carefully worded apologies written by lawyers. The public statement did not match the private persistence of belief, and the private persistence had consequences. Ideas propagate. They shape policy, embolden actors, and in the extreme case of Nazi Germany, contribute to catastrophic violence. Each of these contradictions is a strike against the tidy myth. The generous narrative still holds some truth. Ford did revolutionize production and make products accessible. But the cracks show a life where technology and ideology, generosity and coercion, public theater and private enforcement, existed in uneasy and often dangerous combination. By the end of this section, the picture of Henry Ford is no longer a single portrait on a museum wall. It is a montage: gleaming cars, surveillance reports, battered organizers, nostalgic villages, paid apologies, and foreign medals. The myth and the man are entangled. The question now is not whether one can admire innovation and condemn cruelty. The question is how we let one erase the other, and why we allowed the gentle portrait to become the only one we teach. These first fissures are no longer footnotes. They are trails. Follow them, and you begin to see that what happened at Ford was not a collection of oddities, but the formation of a pattern that would ripple through labor, culture, and global politics. The next stage is to look deeper into the engine room, the networks, the propaganda, the choices that turned private prejudices into public consequences. That is where the darkest core waits to be examined. He appears on screen not in a photograph, but in the small motions people rarely notice. The way he folded a paper, the way a door closed behind him, the pause before he spoke. Those are the backstage gestures that tell you who Henry Ford really was. Picture a narrow corridor off the main factory floor. The noise of presses and belts filters through a heavy door. Men in oil-stained shirts pass time with cigarettes. A clock on the wall ticks with the calm cruelty of routine. Through a second door, an office opens onto silence rugs, heavy furniture, and a man who expects obedience. Henry Ford sits there, the factory visible through window slats, and he does not need to raise his voice. He owns the rhythm of the place. A foreman clears his throat and reports on production. Ford flicks a page and corrects a figure. He does not delegate the last word. He never did. This was not casual oversight. It was a form of governance. You learned in classrooms that Ford was the genius who made the Model T affordable and the assembly line efficient. Those facts are true. What schoolbooks rarely show is the architecture of control he built around those facts, the human system that allowed a single man's tastes and fears to shape millions of lives. One of the central instruments of that control was surveillance. The factory had spy networks not because of paranoia alone, but because surveillance was a mechanism of power. The sociological department, formed to enforce the $5 wage, is the famous example. But the surveillance web went beyond that benign-sounding name. Men trailed other men from the time they left. When union organizers stepped on a company property, they did not face management alone. They faced men who moved like shadows and acted like a different law. That law bent in other ways too. Henry Ford was obsessive about control in his family, and his household politics echoed in the corporation. Edsel Ford, his only son, was speared daily by his father's low-voiced contempt. In public, Edsel held a title. In private, he was a whipping post. Meetings that could have been collegial became arenas where Edsel was publicly undermined. Staff learned quickly. Policy could be ratified in a boardroom only to be quietly revoked in a solitary conversation with the founder. This verticality, the idea that power stops at one man's whim, is the same force that made surveillance and repression possible. Control also took cultural shape. Ford's distrust of expertise was not mere eccentricity. He believed, often bluntly, that talent could and should be subordinated to will. He would praise an inventor's capacity and then demand they conform to his aesthetic or ideological sense of order. Engineers who proposed alternative designs to his cherished projects found themselves dismissed as impediments. The result was a company that prized loyalty in the form of obedience over the messy, sometimes revolutionary friction that real innovation requires. And then there was the economy of compassion that folded into calculation. The famous $5 day stabilized labor, but came with intrusive conditions. The sociological department recorded whether a wife saved money, whether a father smoked, whether a home looked respectable by Ford's rural standards. Fail a home inspection and the company could adjust pay or terminate employment. Workers who benefited materially found themselves morally monitored. The bargain seemed, at first glance, generous. At second glance, it looked like a contract to be a certain kind of person. When the Depression deepened, Ford's personal priorities hardened into corporate policy. He cut wages, not out of shared sacrifice, but because his balance sheet and his stubborn autonomy mattered more than public sacrifice. The man who had once projected paternal benevolence now applied the same mechanisms of control to cut costs. Entire departments emptied as layoffs piled up. You can imagine those clear, brisk memos, dry language that concealed the old man's pleasure at the appearance of efficiency. Where a public figure might have appealed to national sacrifice, Ford opposed relief programs that threatened his independence. He was a patriot of autonomy, both for himself and his company. That autonomy meant he would not trade his margin for anyone else's comfort. Power, too, circled beyond labor into culture. Greenfield Village, his recreated small town, was an aesthetic lever. He curated a white, pastoral past and placed himself as steward of that imagined America. Standing on a church step at Greenfield, visitors absorbed an unspoken narrative. Progress under Ford's direction did not have to mean moral complexity. The village offered a tidy story that linked his innovation to a timeless national identity. It is a dissonant image, a recreated frontier beside a growing industrial empire, yet precisely the kind of image a man who wanted to shape thought would commission. These instruments, spies, enforcers, family dominance, cultural theater combined into a lived reality many of his workers knew intimately. For the few who dared speak out, reprisal was not abstract. Dismissals, blacklisting, threats to families. For the many who accepted the bargain, there was a quiet humiliation that metastasized into a form of social control. The factory, the museum, the local church could each be a site of surveillance. And then there were the alliances behind the scenes. Bankers who liked a steady dividend, regional politicians who praised local jobs, clergy who accepted donations and offered moral cover. Power does not act in isolation. It works by finding institutions willing to be useful. Ford's version of success was built on mutual convenience. The company offered stability and patronage. The community offered silence and applause. When you stand in a small Midwestern town, and see a plaque about a factory's founder, what you often do not see are the whispered agreements beneath it. A key axis of that backstage story is the normalization of violence. The Battle of the Overpass, men beaten in a public square, was not a one-off eruption. It was the thermodynamic release of a system that had normalized force as a response to dissent. Men like Harry Bennett acted not as rogue thugs, but as embedded elements of corporate strategy. Intimidation, surveillance, private policing. These were tools selected because they worked. If you find yourself accepting that men in suits sometimes do terrible things for the sake of profit, the deeper shock is how normalized those things became. The truly striking detail is not that Ford used his power to crush dissent, but that he systematized it with the dispassionate precision of an engineer. The pattern matters because it shows intention. This is not merely the action of a difficult man in a time of turmoil. It is the work of an architect of social order who used managerial technique to produce a society he preferred. That artist's studio extended from the factory floor to neighborhoods, from philanthropic gifts to cultural displays. And yet, as complex as those patterns are, they were not yet the darkest center. Control can exist for decades without revealing the core of a worldview. But systems tend to strain at the seam. Tendencies become policies. Policies become public events. Something was moving in the wings, an event that would make private prejudice public policy and private writing public menace. Everything that had been done discreetly, in offices and back rooms, was about to be amplified. The machinery of control, perfected in the margins, was ready for its loudest test. What happened next would no longer be only about labor disputes and family feuds. It would ask a far uglier question. What happens when cultural authority and mass communication are turned toward hate? The curtain is about to rise on that darker stage. The press run at the Dearborn Independent began as a local enterprise. It became an instrument that extended Henry Ford's private convictions across oceans. He bought the paper in 1919, ostensibly to advance local interests. The early issues were stolid. Then, over months, its voice changed. The paper began to carry a series that would last 91 continuous weeks. The International Jew, the world's foremost problem. The title itself reads like a project rather than a commentary. It read like an investigation. It functioned like a campaign. To understand the timing, picture the post-war moment. Europe was raw after the First World War. Germany was a country humiliated, angry, searching for explanation. In that climate, old prejudices found new arguments. Ford's pamphlets and editorials did not invent anti-Semitic motifs. They repurposed them, polished them, and gave them the imprimatur of an American industrial magnate. The content followed a pattern. Each week an essay asserted a facet of a global conspiracy: control of banks, manipulation of the press, subversion of governments. The Dearborn writers repackaged the discredited protocols of the elders of Zion with modern American anxieties. They argued, with pseudo-documentary tone, that Jewish influence was everywhere and pernicious. Where evidence failed, insinuation filled the space. Where evidence existed, it was used out of proportion to weave a single, terrifying story. What made this effort consequential was not only its rhetoric, but its reach. The Dearborn Independent was not a small-town sheet. Through clever distribution and the vault of Ford's dealership network, its circulation ballooned to the hundreds of thousands. Cars came with newspapers. Mechanics handed out copies. If Ford's dealers were branches of his industrial tree, the paper was its printed fruit, tasting of rumor and conviction. Imagine those stacks of newspapers sitting in showrooms, framed, endorsed, handed to customers as if they were part of the sale. The volume and translation of the material turned domestic prejudice into an international commodity. Ford compiled the series into 4 volumes and had them translated into 16 languages. The booklets traveled to Germany and beyond, into the hands of readers primed to accept their framework. In Munich, in a cramped office with maps on the wall, A rising politician kept these volumes on a shelf. Hitler, for one, displayed Ford's portrait with a kind of personal reverence. In Mein Kampf, Ford is singled out not for manufacturing engineering. Ford's public response to the libel suits is instructive. He authorized an apology that read like legal containment rather than moral reckoning. The wording was crafted by counsel, designed to pacify without conceding intellectual or moral ground. Privately, according to contemporary accounts, Ford did not renounce the view. He rationalized, refused full withdrawal, and preserved an attitude that would not be easily erased. The immediate human cost is harder to quantify, but no less real. Hate travels in increments, a slur here, an exclusion there, than policies that follow the sentiment. In Germany, where anti-Semitism was a pre-existing force, Ford's translated tracts became frosting on a cake of resentment. They were not the cause, but they were fuel. Beyond the court cases and the foreign adulation, there is the question of intent and responsibility. Historians debate degrees. How much did Ford's writings directly propel Nazi policy? Causation in history rarely runs cleanly, but influence is not the same as accident. When a man with Ford's wealth and public standing chose to underwrite a sustained, translated campaign of hate, the choice was consequential. Imagine one of those Dearborn editorials printed in a rural German pamphlet, handed to a clerk in a factory town. The clerk reads a tidy American voice named Henry Ford and thinks, if an American industrialist sees this clearly, maybe my anger is not merely local. Ideas cross borders faster than armies. When they find receptive audiences, the consequences become structural. The Shapiro trial did something else. It revealed how propaganda could be packaged as journalism. The Dearborn Independent used the forms of evidence, footnotes, citations, the cadence of investigation, while skipping the rigorous skepticism a true reporter practices. The effect is subtle and powerful. Readers think they are being shown proof rather than guided through an argument that presupposes guilt. That is the danger of respectable hate. It wears the clothes of authority. It sits in waiting rooms and dealerships. It nests where ordinary people expect reliable information. And it scales. There is another angle to this story that deserves attention: the complicity of silence. Many in America knew of Ford's editorials and accepted them with a fatalistic shrug. He's a crank, some said. He's old-fashioned, others said. But silence has weight. The absence of a robust, concerted moral rebuke from his peers, from influential newspapers, and from sectors of industry allowed this project to persist longer than it might have. Not everyone was silent. Jewish organizations, minority press outlets, and a handful of reform-minded Americans fought back. Boycotts had some economic effect. The lawsuits exposed practices. But economic power and narrative control are hard to undo once they are entrenched in mainstream institutions. And so Ford, simultaneously the inventor of a democratic technology, the affordable automobile, and the financier of an anti-democratic discourse, became a paradox that the nation found difficult to resolve. The contradiction sits at the center of the 20th century. Modern mechanical innovation paired with archaic and destructive social visions. The moral center of the episode is not simply that a wealthy man spread lies. It is that he used his prestige to give those lies authority. The Dearborn Independent transformed private prejudice into public architecture. It showed how cultural respectability could become a vehicle for exclusion and terror. After the lawsuits, the translations, the foreign parades of admiration, the world shifted again. Ford retreated from the direct sponsorship of the most egregious materials, but the ideas persisted in communities, in pamphlet stalls, and in political speech. A public apology on paper did not erase the contact between prejudice and influence. It did not remove portraits of Ford from parlors in Germany. It did not undo the chain of small acts that follow once someone in power legitimizes a story about a people. This was the core of the harm. Not a single act of violence, but the legitimization of a narrative that others could then turn into policy, into laws, into systemic exclusion. The Dearborn Independence pages were a map printed, distributed, and translated that pointed to a scapegoat. It is a map that, in the wrong hands, can lead to catastrophe. The question then becomes, how do institutions respond after a powerful man used his influence to give weight to poisonous ideas? Do they scrub the archives, issue statements, quietly rebrand affection? Or do they build shields, educational reforms, museum plaques with fuller histories, curricular changes that teach not only the machines but the context in which they were made? The cultural choices that came next were as consequential as the original essays. The story that the nation would tell about Henry Ford could either treat the Dearborn Independent as a footnote, or it could force a deeper accounting. Which path would be chosen would shape how millions understood the man and the era. But before that accounting could happen, the propaganda had already seeded a pattern, a model for how a wealthy, reputable figure could manufacture and export dangerous ideas. That template, once seen, could be replicated. And it would be, if the Dearborn Independent revealed the engine of Ford's ideological reach. The decades that followed show the gearbox. How a society takes a complex life and grinds it into a usable legend. After the legal storms and the international scandals, Henry Ford did not vanish. He and those around him set to work on a different project, reputation management. The operation was not a single press release, but a multi-decade effort across media, institutions, and generations. It used the most modern tools of persuasion available: films, museums, classrooms, foundations, and the slow hand of institutional reputation building. Start with the obvious: a team of publicists and image managers. They rewrote narratives in subtle ways. The machine emphasized the farm boy origin story and the Model T's impact on mobility. Films and corporate pamphlets presented Ford as an inventor with calloused hands and common sense. They emphasized the $5 day and the stability it brought. They framed his battles with unions as principled stands for direct employer-worker relations, a paternalistic exchange of loyalty for welfare. Cinematically, it was brilliant. A short instructional film of a smiling Ford among workers is a different document than a clipped news photo of a strike. Moving images make people. The company financed documentaries and museum exhibits that showed streamlined machines and proud workers. The camera does what memory often cannot. It smooths edges through selective framing. Next came institutions eager to claim a lineage. Industry associations, trade journals, and museums had an interest in presenting an origin story that glorified efficiency and enterprise. The Henry Ford Museum, funded in part by Ford himself and later curated by trustees with incentives to protect the brand, became a place where objects of invention were vitrines of progress untethered to the man's blemishes. The museum didn't merely preserve cars, it curated a collective identity. America as a place where invention, not ideology, won the day. Textbooks followed. In the Cold War context, America needed industrial heroes. The ideological contest with communism required proof that capitalism produced its own benefactors. Schools adopted simplified storylines. The Model T fit neatly into curricular arcs that celebrated free enterprise. Ford's more disquieting episodes, the Dearborn essays, the support from German admirers, the use of surveillance, were either relegated to endnotes or rendered as eccentricities unworthy of curricular time. The image that students memorized was efficient, benevolent, and uniquely American. Hollywood, too, played its part. Feature films and biopics, carefully produced, and often with corporate cooperation, tended to choose narrative arcs that fit cinema's appetite. A flawed hero who triumphs by virtue of ingenuity, not a man who financed hate. The Ford of the silver screen looked like a man of grit and vision. The man who had helped spread anti-Semitic texts did not fit a profitable arc, so that chapter was edited out. The Ford Foundation, established later by the family, further homogenized the name. Philanthropy is a powerful form of reputation laundering. Grants to universities and cultural institutions created webs of gratitude. Endowments put the Ford name onto buildings, and the net effect was a disciplinary partition. Innovations belong to economists and engineers. The moral questions belong to occasional ethicists. Popular culture took the sanitized product and turned it into merchandise. The museum gift shop sold models and coffee table books. School field trips produced neat stories for children. The hero who made cars cheap. When an entire cultural apparatus repeats an image enough times, it becomes common sense. The portrait of Henry Ford as a genial genius became something people could point to as evidence of a simple truth. Progress is generally good, and its architects deserve praise. And yet beneath the smooth, polished surface, a different story persisted in archives and private papers. The surveillance files, Bennett's reports, the internal correspondence, those documents lay in boxes in basements and attics. Researchers with patience and willingness to disturb the tidy narrative found them. When those sources were unearthed, they complicated the story. But by then the myth had infrastructure. One of the more insidious outcomes of Ford's strategy and of the society's willingness to accept that strategy is the template it provided. Relevant elites learned a lesson. If you create valuable technologies and donate enough to key institutions, you can rewrite or at least repurpose your public memory. The playbook is straightforward. Produce innovation, underwrite culture, place your name on institutions, let the narrative circulate until it ossifies. The moral consequences are cleaned away by the very mechanisms that celebrate success. This template has modern echoes. Consider how modern tech magnates sponsor museums, universities, and think tanks. When a figure with immense wealth funds cultural institutions, the institutions that receive support face incentives explicit and implicit to curate narratives favorable to donors. The more the donor's name is on a building, the less likely institutional memory will foreground inconvenient truths. It is not necessarily a conspiracy. It is a set of incentives aligning to produce a sanitized public record. The Ford case also shows a softer mechanism, omission. When painful facts are pushed to the margins, younger generations learn a truncated story. They grow up admiring the Model T without ever seeing the files showing how dissent was crushed or how propaganda was financed. That omission is active. The power of absence should not be underestimated. What is not taught becomes a social blind spot. Still, there were pushbacks. Journalists and historians reopened files. Activists organized boycotts and campaigns. Some museums revised plaques and exhibits. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, retrospection forced many institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Yet these reckonings were partial and often incremental. Institutional reputations, once built, are resilient. The tension here is essential for the viewer. Progress and reputation are not the same as moral clarity. A technology that changed daily life does not cleanse the hands of those who exploited public voice to spread hatred. The Ford story demonstrates that technical brilliance can cohabit with profound moral failure, and that society's tools for memory, museums, schools, films can be wielded to prefer comfort over truth. If that leaves you with a quiet unease, that unease is the point. The process that turned Henry Ford into a near untouchable icon was not spontaneous. It was a coordinated, multi-decade reimagining that used media, philanthropy, and national needs to sculpt a myth. The myth served needs commercial, political, emotional, and those needs had a price: the erasure of victims and the normalization of certain prejudices. The final, and perhaps most dangerous, lesson is practical and modern. The Ford model showed how a respected figure could package fringe ideas as respectable through media ownership and institutional patronage. In our era of digital platforms, the capacity to manufacture plausibility has only grown. The basic technique is unchanged. Use reputation to confer credibility. Use distribution channels to make ideas seem mainstream. Use cultural capital to absorb criticism. Knowing this, the question becomes urgent. What checks and balances do we have against reputational laundering today? How do we ensure that honors and institutions reflect full histories, not merely the polished chapters? If we cannot answer those questions, we risk repeating the same mistake, turning innovators into unexamined icons and leaving their darker legacies to fester in the footnotes. The machine that manufactured the Ford myth did not grind to a halt with his death. It evolved, and the country learned, in the most practical way, that heroes are not simply created by deeds. They are curated. The curators decide the frame, and with the frame, they decide who is remembered and how. The consequences of those decisions follow us still. The next segment of this story asks us to stop looking at artifacts and start looking at ourselves. How do we balance admiration for technical accomplishments with a demand for moral accountability? The answer will determine not only how we remember Henry Ford, but how we elect and celebrate leaders in our own time. What will we choose to keep, and what will we finally decide to unearth? A truthful portrait of Henry Ford refuses the easy moral categories and instead assembles a figure both familiar and disturbingly new. A man whose technical mind produced immense public good and whose social imagination produced immense private harm. He is not a cartoon villain. He is not an American saint. He is a strategist of systems, machines, factories, narratives who treated people the way he treated parts. Measurable, replaceable, optimizable. Begin with the machinery, because this is where Ford's mind shows itself most clearly. He saw production as an engineering problem. The camera lingers on a factory floor, belts, pistons, a man in coveralls whose face is lit by sparks. In that light, Ford's achievement looks undeniable. He reduced the price of a car to the point that whole lives rearranged around the possibility of mobility. That is real. You can see it in roads cut through fields, in towns that no longer perish when the tractor leaves. That achievement matters, and it matters precisely because it reshaped a nation. But the same habits that made the machine efficient also shaped his politics. Where an engineer sees inefficiency, Ford saw disorder to be corrected. Human complexity became a defect to be engineered out. The $5 day, often read as benevolence, reads differently when you sit in a kitchen where a sociologist from Ford's office takes notes on who drinks, how many children sleep in the same bed, whether a woman works on Sundays. The higher wage is a lever that tightened control. The sociological form becomes surveillance. The wage becomes a contract of conduct. That juxtaposition, generosity as disciplining instrument, is the key to understanding him. Look at his rhetoric. In public, the language is homespun, the farm boy who made good. But in private correspondence and in the pages of the Dearborn Independent, the cadence shifts. There is an administrative coolness to the conspiratorial claims, lists of names, alleged networks, supposed financial flows. The prose borrows the register of investigation to lend authority to prejudice. It is a technique, make accusation look like audit. Where there are gaps, insinuation fills the space. Where evidence exists, it is inflated to a system. That rhetorical habit is not a quirk, it is an organizing principle. It turns suspicion into policy. Several concrete tensions illuminate the man. He praised the simple life while building Greenfield Village as a kind of curated past. He denounced expertise while hiring legions of specialized managers, publicists, and archivists to curate his memory. He funded a peace ship and profited from war contracts. These are not random contradictions. They are the moves of a strategist playing multiple boards, moral posture in public, market calculus in private, cultural engineering as legacy work. There are human layers too. He could be paternal and cruel in the same week, paying a wage that fed a family, then firing the breadwinner for failing a home inspection. He could admire industrial discipline while endorsing racial and religious hierarchies that justified exclusion and violence. Those choices had consequences that went far beyond uncomfortable opinions. They fed institutions, they crept into curricula, they crossed oceans in translation. Historians debate degrees. Some it migrated, mutated, and settled into habits of work, of memory, and of power that shaped the present. To see that legacy, imagine three overlapping planes: the workplace, the culture of public memory, and the playbook of elite influence. Each plane carries traces of Ford's choices. On the workplace plane, the echo is literal and everyday. The assembly line principle break complex work into discrete, timed tasks migrated from chassis to call center, from factory to warehouse, from the meatpacking plant to the algorithms that now nudge gig workers. Picture a warehouse, fluorescent lights, scanners beeping, handheld devices tracking every step. Efficiency is quantified in seconds and meters. When managers watch dashboards instead of faces, when bonuses hinge on metrics that ignore context, you are watching Ford's logic at scale. That logic can raise productivity and living standards. It can also hollow out agency, degrade skill, and normalize surveillance. When a smartphone pings a driver with the next ride, the model of labor as a sequence of optimized actions is alive and well. Culturally, Ford helped institutionalize a comforting origin story: progress created by solitary geniuses, rewarded by market success. That story is useful. It suits corporations, museums, and school curricula. It is also selective. The Henry Ford Museum displays inventions. It seldom displays the papers that reveal how those inventions sat alongside bigotry. When the museum's gift shop sells a Model T replica to a school group, the child learns an image of progress without the full moral ledger. Pedagogy chooses neat arcs. Complexity gets footnotes. Then there is the most insidious plane, the template for reputational laundering. Ford showed how wealth plus strategic philanthropy plus cultural patronage can recast a public image. Donate to universities, endow museum wings, fund exhibits, underwrite documentaries, put your name on chairs and buildings. Each act of generosity builds gratitude and, over time, creates defense mechanisms inside institutions. The Ford Foundation and later philanthropic arms softened public inquiry into the founder's record. That pattern is not unique to the Ford family. It is visible in modern tech titans who give scholarships, fund labs, and endow cultural centers. The question is structural. When the donor's name sits on the building, how likely is the institution to foreground criticism? The propaganda playbook Ford used owned distribution channels, package conspiracies as investigations, translate, and export them looks eerily familiar in the digital age. Swap newspapers for platforms, dealerships for app stores, and you have a similar dynamic. Reputational authority confers plausibility. Ford's international Jew traveled to Germany and found receptive hands. Today, memes condense narratives and travel fast. The mechanics differ, the structural vulnerabilities do not. There are also direct lines from Ford's narratives to contemporary conspiracy currents. The image of a faceless, global elite manipulating finance and media echoes the architecture Ford popularized. Modern extremists quote fragments of older tracks. Some use Ford's text verbatim without attribution. The veneer changes phrases like globalist, replace earlier slurs, but the logic persists. Identify a scapegoat, claim hidden control, propose exclusion as remedy. That architecture is dangerous because it scales. And yet the legacy is not all shadow. Suburbanization, access to mobility, the creation of mass industry, these are still concrete improvements in the lives of millions. The ache comes in holding both facts together: material progress and moral failure. How do you teach both? How do you curate a museum that shows both the Model T and the Dearborn Independent? How do you endow a foundation without burying uncomfortable archives? We can point to partial corrections. Scholars reopened files. Journalists ran investigations. Activists pushed museums to add exhibits that contextualize. Some university courses now teach innovation alongside ethics. But these fixes are incremental and often defensive. Institutional memory moves slowly. Names on buildings do not come down overnight. The narratives that sweep classrooms and screens resist nuance. The larger danger is a social lesson Ford taught by example. Produce something of undeniable utility, then use the proceeds to shape how history will remember you. That lesson has modern disciples. It makes public institutions cautious and private reputations resilient. It also reduces victims to the margins. If that discomfort feels immediate, that's the point. The Ford case is a cautionary tale about the arithmetic of influence. Innovation plus resources plus cultural patronage can equal moral insulation. Recognizing that pattern matters because the same incentives exist now, magnified by scale and speed. The last shot here is of a school bus pulling up outside the Henry Ford Museum. The children run toward polished machines, unaware of boxes of correspondence in an archive room behind the exhibits. The archive waits. The story continues. Who will open it next? We have followed one thread. A man who changed how the world moved, and who also helped change how the world misrecognized itself. The arc is simple to trace and hard to accept. Shock, tidy myth, fissures, hidden operations, a catalytic act of harm, and then a long, deliberate repair of reputation. You watch the medals and the Model T, and then you watch the paper trail that connected a factory owner in Michigan to an office in Munich. Now the interrogation turns to you. How many of the figures you learned to admire were curated into palatable stories? How many museum plaques and school chapters are the product of a careful editing process that leaves victims in footnotes? What have we been taught to forgive in the name of progress? If you stayed to the end, thank you for sitting with the discomfort. If this resonated, subscribe. This channel will keep opening files like this one. Tell us in the comments where you watched from. Share a classroom story about who you learned to admire and what you later discovered. There are more dossiers waiting to be unsealed. The question we leave you with is simple and brutal. What do we lose when we love our innovators more than we listen to their victims?